Continuing on, we have our ways of selecting the GE that we want to work on. We can choose the bank, or we can click this, which is going to highlight the current bank in our KDF file. Similarly, this drop-down menu is for all of the items in our current bank, so I can choose any one that I want. Or I can click this arrow and it'll just open up a separate window for that instead of, it's the same exact window as this. You can see it starts off with 00 art model, 0 art model. So it just depends on how you want to access it. A lot of redundancy here. Of course, you can click these up and down arrows as well to switch banks, which will automatically switch the GE. You can do the same thing for that. Go back to bank A and go down to my GE tutorials. We have this force mono button, which is usually this first control here, but because I initialized this as a DP1 type in the last video, this actually doesn't use the force mono button. You're not going to want to use that button with drums because you wouldn't really want to make the drums mono ever. But yeah, so that is its own dedicated control in the GE editor. With any other kind of GE, almost any other kind of GE, like if I cruise down to a CL1 and I click that, you can see that it's grayed out because that is now accessible from this control in the real-time controls. If I try to click that parameter now, it'll give me this little warning dialog saying like, oh, you're messing up because this is already part of your RTC model. But it does no harm to actually edit it. The only way to edit it would be to hold Alt or Command if you're on a Mac. So I could just click Sure for that dialog box, and I could hit Alt and then click, oh, my bad, hit Control and then click. And that will allow me to change the parameter independently of my switches. Of course, if I were to toggle this switch, it would make this parameter jump to its normal parameter, and if I hit it again, they remain perfectly mirrored. It's just kind of to help you not mess up, I suppose, like not change parameters that aren't reflected in your real-time controls. Because remember, when you are actually using Karma, you're always going to be using it, in a live situation with the real-time controls. So it doesn't really make sense to like necessarily edit it as if you are using it in a studio environment. It's really a live tool. That's like the whole purpose of Karma. It's probably the best electronic live tool in existence. But yeah, so after that we have our tempo, and yes, GEs have their own tempo. I believe the tempo is initialized when we initialize the GE. Let's check. Let's initialize this to a DM1. Yeah, the tempo does get initialized. So when you're creating GEs, you often create them with a certain tempo in mind. Like, if you're making a drum beat, you might make a drum and bass beat, in which case it would be all the way up at, 174. And this tempo works kind of in conjunction with the performance editor tempo. That is to say, one actually overrides the other. So let's say that it would probably be easiest for me to show you with a CL1 initialized. So I have Karma on. Let's say that I just play a C. It's going to start arping a C. And if I change the tempo, so we're at 240 right now, right? But then if I change the tempo here in the performance editor, which is just like changing the tempo via the tempo knob on the Chronos, jumps all the way down to 119. So these both will override each other, but they allow you to set the tempo in such a way that when you recall a GE, you know what tempo it's supposed to be at. It's kind of like a tempo reference. When you load a GE, like when I'm going and choosing different GEs, usually it's always going to be referencing the performance editor's tempo. So right now I just reloaded this GE after saving it at 240, but when I play it, it's operating at 120 as opposed to this ridiculously fast rate. There is a kind of glitch here where Karma basically just, its internal clock will function off of whatever whatever it was last changed to. So you can see the time is beeping really fast right here, the tempo. So even though I switched to this GE, which is at 100 and this is at 120, it's still technically operating at 240 since that was its last command to operate at. But if I change this, then we are back at 120. Now, I can set things up via the options menu to when I load a GE, it loads that GE's tempo into the performance editor. So now when I click down and I'm at 240, you can see 240 is now reflected in the performance editor. And that does count as a command for it to change tempo. Yep, but I like to leave that option off. It's basically so you can hear a GE at the tempo that it was designed to be played at. But usually when you're just kind of bouncing around GEs, you want to hear them in the tempo of the song that you're making. So I would leave that option off most of the time. I'm going to set this back down to 120 and hit store. It's going to, oh, you know what? I don't want to store that. I want to actually cruise down to my GE tutorials. There we go. And I can actually just click that and click 120, hit enter, then hit store, which saves the GE, but there's still changes that have been made to the to the performance, or you can think of this as like the Karma module. So I need to actually make that 120 as well, then store it, and then just hit Control S to save my KDF file. So this is all saved now. Let's see. This section is really straightforward. Which one is it? Is my RT parameters. This is kind of just a reflection of choosing which module you're working with. So when I click this, you can see that's reflected here. It's actually not reflected in the real-time controls editor. I kind of wish it were. Maybe in a future update. But at the same time, that wouldn't make sense because you want to be able to change controls for whatever, usually global. You'll usually want the master layer enabled here while you're making individual edits to individual modules. So yeah, it's actually a good thing that that's not reflected there. But these two editors, it does show a reflection between choosing which module you're working with in the performance editor and then just choosing it down here in the GE editor. And yet again, there's more redundancy at the top of the performance editor where you can change modules there. And then these are just data displays here, which shows us our phase, which we'll talk about in the phase group, and then our pattern, which we'll talk about again in the phase group. So we'll get to those a bit later. And then lastly, we have this section over here, which I'm actually going to stop this video at this point because these are going to take a fair bit of explaining. So